So one of the things that I know that I would talk to most people about who had been subjected to different forms of abuse and violence and trauma is first of all about the way that we react and respond to that when it's happening to us. And that can be a source of a lot of guilt and a lot of shame and a lot of confusion. A lot of questions come up about, why didn't I know it was happening to me? Or why didn't I figure out what they were doing? Or maybe for some of you, you sort of knew what they were doing, but you were still stuck there. So you knew that you couldn't report, or you knew that it would be too dangerous to try and escape. Or maybe if you were a child, you actually did have no way out because, it was your parents abusing you, or a carer or family member where there isn't a way out of that situation at that time. So, for some people, they live through these traumas and it keeps, they keep being subjected to it, but they have this sort of understanding that there isn't really a way out. And so I wanted to talk about those reactions, those responses, especially because the research shows that we hold a lot of guilt and blame, like self-blame and shame, if we don't do what we think we should have done in that moment. And we judge ourselves a lot for that. So it's quite common for us to question why we didn't fight back, question why we didn't shout or scream, question why we didn't tell somebody, question why we didn't report it straight away to the police or something like that. And actually those reactions that I just listed are really rare. There's not a lot of people that will go through sexual violence, abuse, assaults, exploitation, where their first reaction is something like fight back and go straight to a police station. They're actually quite rare. Most people don't fully know what's happening to them or don't know how to react to it. So I guess the first thing to talk about would be the actual responses in the moment, when that assault happened to you, when you were being subjected to that type of abuse. And in our field, we talk quite a lot about the 5 F's of trauma. And I don't know really if there's 5. There's research that would suggest there is. Some people say there's 4, some people say there's 3. But they are fairly useful. And the research is getting there in terms of trauma. So if we talk about those first, we tend to talk generally about adrenal responses and about the way we react to things that scare us and put us in a dangerous position as fight or flight. And this is a response that people observe in the animal kingdom and throughout our evolution. And so we tend to say that if we're in a really scary situation, we'll fight or we'll try and escape. Actually, that doesn't really ring true when it comes to sexual abuse and violence or domestic abuse. Because fight as a reaction to that trauma is extremely dangerous in those situations. That is, if you've been groomed, if you've been controlled, if you have been repeatedly, systematically, broken down by somebody, your first reaction is not going to be to try and fight that person off, because even if it's not a fully conscious decision, it's not logical to do it because you might put yourself in further danger. So fighting back is not generally a primal sort of first initial response to sexual violence or domestic violence at all. And we know that it's one of the rarest responses to this type of interpersonal trauma. Then you've got flight, which is like trying to escape that situation. That doesn't necessarily mean running away. Trying to flight as an adrenal response would mean getting out of that situation in whatever way possible. Again, not that common in abuse and sexual violence and trauma. Mainly because that also would put you in danger, I imagine. And for most of us, because of how effectively we're groomed before the abuse, the assaults, the rapes, the trafficking, the exploitation starts, you also wouldn't necessarily respond with that type of trauma reaction, especially if you love the abuser, which we'll talk about in some other videos. But that's one of the most key things I think around this, is that is that some of these trauma responses, they make sense in particular situations. If you're randomly being attacked on the street, or you know, you're in a really dangerous situation where a stranger approaches you. But actually, for most of us, the most sexual violence and abuse occurs within a relationship where we really trust that person, or we love them, or we respect them, or, you know, we want to please them, or they're our parents or our family members or someone that's really important to us. So therefore, that sort of traditional fight or flight response is not going to kick in, because there are other things going on. And this is why I sort of reject the pure explanation of trauma responses as being non-cortical, that there's no sort of executive functioning that occurs and that it's purely primal, because if it was, we wouldn't take all of those things into account before we reacted. So for example, you know, if a person is being raped, but they know that if they try and fight back, that situation is going to get a lot worse, then they won't fight back. But that would suggest that there's been some decision making, some executive functioning there. So it can't be a purely instinctive response, in my opinion. So then that's just 2 F's. And then we talk about, so we've got fight, flight, and then we have freeze, which is actually our most common response to sexual violence and other forms of interpersonal trauma. There was research in 2017 by Muller et al. That found that 70% of people who are subjected to sexual violence will freeze. So actually that's most of us will freeze in that situation, and we won't do anything. Maybe we feel like we can't talk, we can't move, that we can't make a noise, we can't do anything about that situation, and we freeze until that offence is over. And when you think about that, that's actually a very rational way to respond to something that's very dangerous and that you don't know how you're going to come out of that situation with a dangerous offender, is to stay still. And we do see that type of trauma response in animals as well, you know. There's a reason why they call it rabbit in headlights. It's a freeze response because you don't know how to react to whatever that danger is. So if you had a freeze response, which is probable, then I would want you to feel like that's completely normal. You know, that you don't need to hold guilt around the fact that you froze and you didn't do anything and you didn't know what to do and you don't know why you froze, because the majority of us do. And actually, from a keeping yourself safe type perspective, that makes total sense. If you're in a situation where somebody's already being very violent and oppressive towards you, staying still and preserving your life and preserving yourself makes the most sense. Even children do that. And then the other 2 are friend and flop. Now, most people, when I teach them, will think that flight and fight are your primal responses to fear and danger, but it's actually friend. Because if you think about when you're a baby, you can't fight or flight. So actually what you do is you friend, you call for help, you cry. So when you're wet, you cry. When you're scared, you cry. When you're tired, you cry. When you're hungry, you cry. When there's a loud noise, you cry. And actually, so friend is one of our first responses to fear and trauma. And lots of us actually will use a friend response, especially those of us that have been in situations where we're abused over a long period of time and we're in, you know, an oppressive or abusive situation or relationship, because you learn how to like talk your way out of assaults or talk your way into other situations. And that to me is a friend response to trauma. So, you know, if you were being assaulted or abused or attacked and you're that person that's sort of going, well, okay, but only if you don't do this, or I'll let you do this to me, but not that. You know, if I do this for you, then you won't do this, will you? That's a friend response to trauma, and again, makes total sense. You know, in that situation, you already have an understanding that you're not in control, so you have to like limit the damage, limit the harm to yourself, and so a friend response makes total sense actually. And then the last one is flop. People talk about this in different ways. My understanding of it from all the years that I've worked is, you know, in the way people explain it to me. I've often had people say to me things like, I just sort of went a bit limp and I don't really remember anything and I don't feel like I could move. And people tend to say it's like sort of like going like a rag doll. But I've heard lots of people describe it differently. And some people describe it to me as fainting. So for example, if you're being abused or assaulted, and you sort of just flop and you faint, and you know, they feel almost like they're going to pass out. And so the research around that suggests that that's actually due to such high levels of cortisol in our body, in our brain, that eventually we will shut down. Now I speak, I'll speak of this from personal experience, because I have this response to just certain things in my life, and I had it fairly recently, where my husband dislocated his shoulder, and his shoulder was like completely out, and I don't know why it happened, but I think it was what his shoulder looked like and the noise he was making, because he was shrieking, and he was asking me to ring 999, and I was on the phone to the ambulance, and everything overwhelmed me, and I felt my entire body just get overwhelmed. I just passed out. And that's not the first time that's happened to me, actually. I've done it in a number of situations where something happens, like it's way too much stress, and my body just goes, no. So it might be that you've experienced something similar to that. It might not have been as dramatic as that. But flop, again, you know, is a really common response, and it's not about you allowing it to happen. I've spoken to a lot of people who say, oh, I felt like I let it happen. It's when it comes to trauma, when it comes to that level of danger, it's not about letting it happen. A lot of the time it is about minimizing further harm to yourself, and that those things are normal. They make sense. If we were in the wild. It makes sense now in this social environment. We know that we're in serious danger. We don't know whether we're going to survive. We don't know what our injuries are going to be. So you do what you can in that moment. The last thing I want to say to you about the way that we respond to abuse is there are some theorists and practitioners and people like that will tell you that you have one trauma response, and that's incorrect. You don't have one set trauma response. So some people will say, oh, you know, my trauma response to things is freeze. And I always freeze. But actually, when you dig into it, you'll have probably gone through a few different trauma responses. So as an example, you might have started off with like a freeze response, where for the first maybe 5 minutes you absolutely don't do anything, and then you might have switched and started a friend response and started bargaining with that abuser, like, I'll do this but I won't do this, you know, leave that person alone if you do this, I'll do this if you don't hurt the kids, that sort of stuff. And then you might have then tried to shout at them or tell them no, which is a fight response. So a lot of us actually, when we really look into it, we have a lot of different ways of responding to trauma. We don't necessarily have this set one way of dealing with it. And again, to me, that's evidence that there is executive functioning going on in the brain, because what you're doing there is you're evaluating a response and then thinking, this isn't working, they're still assaulting me. What if I try talking them out of it? Oh, that isn't working either, what do I do now? Well, maybe I'll tell them I'll just do this act if you don't do this to me. That's, you know, another response to that. And we often move through different responses whilst we're trying to figure out how to keep ourselves safe. So I hope that's given you some more information about how we all respond to different forms of abuse and violence.